The morning in northeastern Nigeria did not begin with explosions. There were no sirens, no warning shots, just heat dust and the uneasy quiet that people living near Sambisa Forest have learned to live with. Children walked toward water points. Farmers stepped into dry fields. On the ground, nothing looked different. But above the trees, something had changed. High in the sky, moving slowly and deliberately, an aircraft traced wide circles over the forest again and again. It wasn't dropping bombs. It wasn't carrying troops. It wasn't in distress. It was watching. And for those who know Sambisa's history, that single detail matters more than any headline. Only days earlier, United States-backed airstrikes had struck ISIS-linked camps in Sokoto, hundreds of kilometers away. Many assumed the story ended there with smoke statements and silence. But wars rarely end when the bombs stop falling. Sometimes that's when the most important phase begins. Because after those strikes, the sky over Sambisa came back to life. Flight tracking data revealed a modified Gulfstream 5 an aircraft commonly used for intelligence surveillance and reconnaissance circling one of the most dangerous militant strongholds in West Africa. Day after day, same routes, same patterns. This wasn't curiosity, it was routine. And routine surveillance sends a message far louder than a single attack. Someone is building a picture. For more than a decade, Sambisa has been a place where fighters vanish, where trails dissolve into trees, where ground patrols struggle to see more than a few meters ahead. But surveillance changes the rules. It listens while it watches. It connects signals, movements, and silence. And once those patterns are mapped, the forest is no longer just cover, it becomes a ledger. So the question is no longer whether the United States is watching Nigeria's most complex battlefield. That part is clear. The real question is why now and what comes next. Is this the final push to break ISWAP's grip on Sambisa, or the start of a longer, quieter campaign whose consequences will unfold far from the headlines? If you believe security stories deserve more than surface-level explanations, please share this video. Subscribe if you think understanding what happens after the strikes is just as important as the strikes themselves. And tell us in the comments, do you believe this phase will finally change Sambisa's fate or repeat a cycle Nigeria has seen before? What first appeared on flight tracking screens did not look dramatic. No sudden dive, no rapid climb, just a slow, deliberate pattern forming in the sky above Sambisa Forest. Wide loops, repeated turns, hour after hour. To most people, it would have meant nothing. But to anyone familiar with military aviation, it was unmistakable. This aircraft was not traveling, it was loitering. And loitering is what surveillance planes do when they are looking for answers. The jet was identified as a modified Gulfstream 5, an aircraft that in civilian life carries executives and diplomats. But this one was built for a different purpose, outwardly quiet, inwardly dense with sensors, designed for intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, what military planners call ISR. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't rush. It simply watches, listens, and records until patterns begin to speak. By the end of that day, Nigerian media and regional analysts were confirming what the flight data already suggested: the United States had resumed ISR operations over Sambisa. The mission had been active before paused briefly, and now it was back. That pause mattered. For one full day, the sky over the forest had gone quiet. No visible surveillance tracks, no circling aircraft. Then, almost immediately after Christmas, the Watcher returned. The timing did not feel accidental. Only days earlier, US-backed airstrikes had hit ISIS-linked camps in Sokoto, far to the northwest. Those strikes made headlines. They came with official statements and bold language. But what followed them told a deeper story, because as soon as the explosions stopped in Sokoto, the eyes in the sky reappeared over Sambisa. This was not a one-off flight. Trackers began noticing the same behavior again and again. The aircraft entered Nigerian airspace from the west, slowed over the forest, traced the same looping paths, then exited hours later only to repeat the routine the next day. The routes were consistent. The timing was consistent. The behavior was consistent. That consistency is the clearest sign of an organized operation. To the average observer, a plane overhead is just background noise. But in a place like Sambisa, it changes everything. Sambisa is not just a forest, it is a maze. Dense vegetation, narrow footpaths, hidden clearings, makeshift camps that can appear and disappear within days. For years, Nigerian troops have pushed into the forest-cleared areas and then watched fighters melt away only to return months later. The terrain favors disappearance. Surveillance is designed to remove that advantage. The Gulf Stream circling above was not searching randomly. It was collecting signals, radios switching on phones, lighting up brief bursts of communication that reveal where people are gathering. It was capturing imagery, subtle movements beneath tree cover, the faint geometry of footpaths, heat signatures that glow after sunset. None of this tells a complete story on its own, but over time these fragments begin to connect. Camps relate to routes. Routes relate to attacks. Silence becomes as meaningful as noise, and all of it points to one central reality: the presence of ISWAP. ISWAP has spent years turning Sambisa into one of its most reliable sanctuaries. When pressure rises elsewhere, fighters retreat here. When attacks are planned, coordination often begins here. When wounded need to disappear, this is where they are taken. Sambisa is not just shelter, it is strategic depth. And that is why the surveillance keeps coming back. Unlike ground patrols, the sky does not tire. It does not need roads. It does not negotiate with terrain. It simply waits. And waiting is powerful, because patterns always repeat. Fighters follow familiar routes. Radios return to known frequencies. Leaders rely on habits they believe are invisible. Surveillance exists to prove that those habits are no longer hidden. What makes this phase different is not the technology alone, but the patience behind it. These flights did not begin after the Sokoto strikes. They began weeks earlier, quietly building a picture long before any bombs fell. Sokoto was not the start. It was one chapter. The watching over Sambisa shows the story is still unfolding and that the most important consequences may come not with noise, but with time. The moment that changed everything did not arrive with a blast over Sambisa. It arrived with silence. On the night of December 25th, as US-backed airstrikes struck ISIS-linked camps in Sokoto, something unusual happened hundreds of kilometers away. The familiar watcher in the sky over Sambisa Forest disappeared. For a full day, there were no visible surveillance tracks, no looping patterns, no aircraft circling above the trees. To casual observers, it meant nothing. To those who follow conflict closely, it meant coordination. In modern counterinsurgency, surveillance and strikes do not compete. They take turns. For weeks, the sky had been collecting fragments, signals, routes, habits, movement patterns stretching across northern Nigeria and the Sahel. Then, when the picture became clear enough, the watching paused and the fire fell. The airstrikes in Sokoto were not random acts of force. They were the moment when intelligence turned into action. And then almost immediately the watching returned. On December 27th, the same modified Gulfstream 5 reappeared over Sambisa, tracing its slow circles, as if nothing had happened except everything had. This return marked the true climax of the operation. Because now the mission was no longer just about observing a known stronghold. It was about measuring the shockwaves of Sokoto as they rippled outward. Did fighters flee toward Sambisa, as they have done so many times before? Did camps suddenly grow as survivors regrouped? Did radios light up with panic instructions and emergency coordination? Did routes that had been quiet for weeks suddenly come alive? This is where surveillance becomes most dangerous for those on the ground. The days immediately after a strike are when mistakes happen. Fighters rush, leaders move, communications spike, safe paths are tested. And every one of those reactions leaves a trace. The sky is built to catch them. To outsiders, Sokoto and Sambisa look like two separate stories, different regions, different headlines, different maps. But for planners, they are part of the same web. Militant networks do not respect state borders. Fighters move along corridors, not political lines. What happens in Sokoto echoes in Sambisa, and the renewed surveillance made one thing clear: the United States understands that connection. The reaction among analysts was immediate. This was no longer a defensive posture. It was preparatory. The goal was not just to prevent another attack, but to shrink the militants' room to breathe. Surveillance after a strike is how pressure is sustained. It turns a single blow into a campaign. For ISWAP, the implications were stark. Sambisa had always been their fallback, the place to absorb losses and reset. But now the fallback itself was under constant observation. Routes once believed to be invisible were likely already mapped. Camps thought to be hidden were being logged. Silence once a shield was becoming suspicious. On the ground, reactions were quieter but just as real. Nigerian forces understood what this phase meant. Intelligence gathered now could shape operations for months, even years. Villages near the forest sensed the tension without seeing its source. No bombs fell, yet the pressure felt heavier. When the sky watches every day, uncertainty becomes its own weapon. Internationally, the message was subtle but clear. The strikes in Sokoto were not a conclusion. They were a signal. The return to Sambisa showed that this campaign was moving into a deeper phase, one where patience mattered more than spectacle. No large deployments, no dramatic announcements, just persistence. This is how modern counterinsurgency tightens its grip. First, disrupt with force, then observe the aftermath, then wait for patterns to repeat. And they always do. What makes this moment the true climax is not what has already happened, but what it makes possible. Surveillance at this level is never the end of a story. It is the quiet middle, the phase where targets are refined, mistakes are cataloged, and the next move is prepared without warning. Sokoto showed what happens when watching turns into fire. Sambisa now shows what happens when fire turns back into watching. Together they form a loop, one that is tightening, and that leads to the next more unsettling question. If this operation is so deliberate, so coordinated, and so sustained, where is it all being run from? Who is directing this hunt from beyond Nigeria's borders? And what does that mean for the balance of control in this long war? From the ground, life around Sambisa Forest looks deceptively unchanged. Villages still wake to heat and dust. Roads remain narrow and scarred. Farmers still weigh whether it's safe to walk a few kilometers farther than usual. But when surveillance becomes routine, the consequences begin to travel downward quietly, unevenly, and with lasting effects. For civilians living near the forest, constant eyes in the sky bring mixed emotions. On one hand, there is hope, fewer ambushes, fewer sudden raids, fewer nights broken by gunfire. When intelligence works as intended, attacks can be disrupted before they reach villages. Routes used by fighters can be avoided. Patrols can move with more certainty. For communities exhausted by years of violence, even a small reduction in fear matters. But surveillance also changes behavior in ways that are harder to measure. Fighters adapt by blending closer to civilians. Camps break into smaller units. Movement shifts to hours when detection is harder. That often means villages become corridors, places militants pass through quietly, briefly, leaving tension behind. Civilians may not see the aircraft above them, but they feel the pressure in conversations that stop suddenly, in unfamiliar faces that appear and disappear. For Nigerian soldiers, the consequences are equally complex. Access to high-quality intelligence can save lives. It can prevent walking blindly into ambushes. It can help plan operations with precision rather than guesswork. Yet it also creates dependence. The most advanced sensors are not Nigerian. The aircraft are not Nigerian. The analysts interpreting raw data may not be Nigerian. Over time, that shifts how decisions are made. As long as interests align, cooperation is powerful. But control over information is control over timing. When to strike, when to wait, where to focus. These choices increasingly depend on who holds the clearest picture of the battlefield. In this case, that picture is being built largely by United States, with coordination routed through Ghana, far from the communities most affected. Politically, this creates a quiet dilemma for Nigeria. On paper, sovereignty remains intact. Operations are coordinated, intelligence is shared. But in practice, reliance grows. When the most detailed map of your hardest battlefield sits outside your borders, influence shifts, even if no one says it out loud. For local leaders, this balance is delicate. They must show progress to citizens who demand safety. They must also guard against the perception that national security is being outsourced. In regions already sensitive to external involvement, that perception matters. It can fuel suspicion, resentment, and political backlash if not managed carefully. There is also the question of expectations. Surveillance creates them. When people know the sky is watching every day, they expect results, arrests, disruptions, a visible reduction in violence. If those outcomes do not materialize, watching becomes just another layer of frustration in a war people are tired of. And if actions do come, raids, arrests, strikes, they will test everything: coordination between partners, protection of civilians, and the ability to turn foreign intelligence into local control. The deeper consequence is this: surveillance shortens the distance between decision and consequence. A mistake caught early can be corrected. But a miscalculation can spread just as quickly. Civilian harm, if it occurs, will not be blamed on technology. It will be blamed on those who chose how to use it. This phase carries hope and risk in equal measure. Hope that intelligence-driven operations might finally reduce the endless cycle of clearing and losing Sambisa. Risk that dependence deepens, expectations rise, and political pressure grows. The forest is being mapped from above. What remains uncertain is whether that map will lead to lasting stability or redraw lines of influence that Nigeria will have to navigate long after the aircraft stop circling. From Washington's perspective, the return of constant surveillance over Sambisa Forest fits a pattern that has been quietly expanding across Africa for years. It is not about dramatic troop deployments or long occupations. It is about presence without footprint, seen more while appearing less. For the United States, this approach solves several problems at once. It limits American casualties, it avoids the political costs of boots on the ground, and it allows U.S. planners to shape outcomes indirectly through intelligence timing and coordination rather than visible force. In an era where public support for foreign wars is thin, surveillance offers influence without headlines. From a strategic standpoint, Nigeria matters far beyond its borders. It is Africa's most populous nation, a regional military heavyweight, and a critical anchor in West Africa's security architecture. If instability deepens here, it does not stay local. It ripples outward into the Sahel, toward the Gulf of Guinea, and across migration and trade routes that reach Europe and beyond. For Washington, preventing that spillover is not charity, it is risk management. That is why the focus on ISWAP is so intense. Among militant groups in the region, ISWAP is viewed as the most organized, the most adaptive, and the most capable of linking local insurgency to global jihadist networks. From the American lens, allowing such a group to entrench itself permanently would be a strategic failure. Surveillance therefore becomes a form of containment, keeping pressure constant, limiting freedom of movement, and waiting for moments of vulnerability. But the global implications do not stop with the United States. Other powers are watching closely. European governments already strained by migration pressures and security fears see Nigeria's fight as an early warning system. A more stable northeast Nigeria means fewer downstream shocks. Regional allies see a test case whether intelligence-led partnerships can succeed where years of ground fighting have stalled. At the same time, there is unease. Quiet surveillance raises questions that go beyond counterterrorism. Who controls the data? Who decides when intelligence becomes action? And how much influence does that grant external actors over internal security decisions? These questions are not unique to Nigeria. They echo across Africa, where partnerships with powerful states often bring both protection and pressure. From the American point of view, the answer is often framed in pragmatic terms. Intelligence is shared, decisions are coordinated, sovereignty is respected. And in many cases that is true. But power in modern warfare rarely announces itself. It accumulates through information. Whoever holds the most complete picture holds leverage, whether or not it is exercised openly. For global audiences, especially in the West, the key takeaway is this: what is happening over Sambisa is not an isolated operation. It is part of a broader shift in how wars are fought and managed. Less spectacle, more surveillance, fewer declarations, more quiet influence. Conflicts do not end with victory parades. They settle into long phases of pressure mapping and selective action. That makes this moment important beyond Nigeria. If this approach succeeds, if constant intelligence helps reduce violence without deepening dependence, it will be cited as a model. If it fails, if surveillance drags on without resolution, it will reinforce skepticism about endless management of conflicts rather than true solutions. From Washington to regional capitals, the watching continues. The sky over Sambisa is only one piece of a much larger picture. But it reveals how power now moves slowly, quietly, and with consequences that may only become visible long after the aircraft have flown their last circle. What is happening over Sambisa Forest is not the end of a story. It is the middle, the quiet stretch where wars decide their future without announcing it. Surveillance at this level is never meant to stand alone. It exists to prepare, to narrow options, to wait for moments when certainty replaces doubt. The strikes in Sokoto showed that action is possible. The return of constant watching shows that preparation is far from over. This phase carries a promise and a warning. The promise is clear. After more than a decade of fighting, Sambisa might finally stop being a place where fighters disappear. Intelligence-driven pressure can break habits, expose roots, and reduce the cycles of clearing and losing the forest again and again. Fewer ambushes mean fewer funerals. Better information can save soldiers and civilians alike. For communities exhausted by fear, even the possibility of lasting change matters. But the warning is just as real. Surveillance builds expectations. When the sky watches every day, people expect results. If nothing follows, no arrests, no disruption, no visible improvement. Watching becomes just another layer of frustration. And if action does follow, it must be precise. Mistakes made with this level of information will not be forgiven easily. Civilian harm, misjudged targets, or political fallout can undo years of careful work in a single moment. There is also a deeper question Nigeria cannot avoid. As intelligence becomes more sophisticated and more external, who ultimately shapes the outcome? Cooperation with partners like the United States brings capability Nigeria has long needed. But capability comes with influence. Over time, reliance can quietly shift decision-making power even when intentions are good and coordination is transparent. Managing that balance will matter long after the aircraft stops circling. For Nigeria, this moment is a crossroads. The hunt in the sky could finally help dismantle ISWAP's grip on Sambisa. Or it could settle into another long phase of pressure without resolution, effective at managing violence but not ending it. History shows that surveillance alone does not finish wars. It sets conditions. What leaders do with those conditions determines everything. And for global audiences, there is a lesson here too. Modern conflict rarely announces itself with clear beginnings or endings. It unfolds in loops, watching, striking, watching again. Power moves quietly through data, patience, and timing. The loudest moments grab attention, but the quiet ones shape outcomes. So the final question is not whether the planes will keep flying. They likely will. The real question is this: when the moment comes to act on everything the sky has learned, will it finally change the fate of Sambisa or simply reset a cycle the region has known for too long? If you believe stories like this deserve depth beyond headlines, please share this video. Subscribe if you think understanding how wars are managed matters as much as knowing where they happen. And let us know in the comments, do you believe this phase will bring real change or just another pause in a conflict that refuses to end?